More than 100,000 federal workers received news on the picket line today that the federal government had put a new offer on the table, but they're not putting their signs away just yet.
We're here for the long haul. We're gonna be here until we get a fair wage offer. So
the picket lines remain strong and strong every day, and we are getting the support of the population at large.
A lot of the employers are going to lose some money, obviously. But, in the end, we'll be better off, and the future people who work for the government will be better off as well.
Larry Savage is a professor of labor studies at Brock University, and he joins me now. Professor Savage, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we heard about this new offer on wages, a comprehensive offer today, and since then, the union and the government have gone very, very quiet. What does that tell you about how these negotiations are going?
Well, that suggests to me that there is positive forward movement. I think the union was waiting for the Treasury Board to make a move. It sounds like that's happened, and they've signaled that they'll work over the weekend, potentially craft a deal.
Yeah, it's the first response on wages from the government since Tuesday evening, I believe. So it's been a couple of days where it's stalled. But, if this does, let's take a positive look at this. If the union does get a deal with a wage increase, what does this mean for other workers and their unions? I mean, will we see more of this sort of activity on the horizon? What sort of precedent could this set?
Well, I think the devil's really in the details. We would really need to see what the union was able to achieve at the bargaining table in order to determine whether or not that might have a contagion effect on the rest of the labor movement in both the public and private sectors. I think if the union is seen as having won on the wage demands and on remote work, we will see other unions start making similar demands. Over the course of the last year or so, I think unions have not been able to keep up with inflation in terms of salary settlements. And so I think people are, in a way, rediscovering the right to strike in order to try to use their unions to get ahead. And of course, in the case of PSAC workers, 2 years without a contract gave those workers some time to build up some anger and resentment. So again, if we see some major moves and breakthroughs at the bargaining table, I think you'll expect other workers stand up and demand the same.
What would be a major breakthrough in your view, right? The government has offered 9%. Presumably that may have increased today. We don't yet know the details. The union wanted 13.5%, and they came down from there. I mean, what would constitute a breakthrough in terms of a wage increase?
Well, I think it's hard to come up with an exact number because you also have to balance the non-monetary issues that are also outstanding in bargaining. Sometimes there'll be a trade-off between the two. So, for example, if the union wins language in its contract around remote work, or it wins stronger provisions around contracting out, they may be willing to take less on the salary scale. And so, it's tough to peg a figure, but I'll leave the negotiators to do that.
Okay, but let's just talk about remote work for a second, because this is a core demand for the Public Service Alliance of Canada. And the government isn't saying no to the idea of remote work. I mean, it's willing to do it, but it's saying no to giving that up as a management right and putting it solely into the collective bargaining agreement. How important is this one issue, do you think, for workers across the country in both the public and the private sector?
Well, I think it is a very important issue for PSAC members, and I think it's important for people to realize that if remote work isn't part of the collective agreement, it's not a right for federal public service workers. Management rights means that management can alter or get rid of a policy whenever it wants. Only if that policy is made up part of the collective agreement is it legally enforceable. And so that's why unions always want these kinds of policies to be embedded in legally enforceable collective agreements. It would be a big win for the federal public service workers to secure remote work rights in their collective agreement. And I think you'd see other public servants certainly demand the same at the provincial level. And I think you'd see office workers in the private sector start demanding the same thing. Like many things that unions do, when they win something big at the bargaining table, it often spreads. Other unions demand the same, and then in many cases, it just becomes a normal standard across the world of work.
Right, that's the contagion effect that you're talking about, right? That it will spread.
Exactly.
But is that why do you think Mona Fortier has called this, the president of the Treasury Board, has called this a red line for her, that they're just simply not willing to go there? I mean, how do you think employers across the country in the public and private sector are looking at this issue? Are they rooting for Mona Fortier to hold the line here, or are they willing to do this as a collectively bargained right?
I think in most cases, employers would be rooting for the federal government to hold the line. This is, I think, a very difficult issue, but one that I don't think is going away. Remember, before the pandemic, unions were making all sorts of demands around flexible work arrangements, and managers were saying, sorry, we can't do that, it's impossible. But then COVID and the pandemic forced everything online, and the sky didn't fall. People were able to work remotely from home. And for so many workers, they realized it wasn't just a flexibility issue. Remote work is also an affordability issue, because it means you don't have to pay for gas to commute to work. You don't have to pay to park or buy your lunch at work. So for a lot of people, flexible work is also something that they're rooting for from an economic perspective. And that makes it a very important issue for the union.
You know, the government to this point, Professor, has really been allergic to any conversation around the idea of back to work legislation. And certainly the signal today that they've made a move in their offer to the union would suggest that that is unlikely. Historically, what would be the tipping point to get to that sort of measure where the government would use the legislature to have to put an end to a labor stoppage?
Right. I mean, the Liberals have used back to work legislation in the past twice. That was in a majority government situation. I think the dynamics changed a little this time because the minority government would probably need to rely on the Conservatives to pass that legislation. And I don't think the Prime Minister wants to be put in the awkward position of having to rely on the Conservatives to trample on labor rights. So I think that back to work legislation is unlikely in this case. It's a real political hot potato for the government. But of course, if a strike does drag on a long time, that public services are disrupted in a way that could potentially harm public safety, I think you'll see more and more calls for back to work legislation. But it looks like that is a scenario that may be avoided if a deal can be hammered out this weekend.
Okay, Professor Larry Savage, we really appreciate your time and perspective. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.